The emergency room went quiet for half a second before the shouting started. A patient monitor screamed. Someone dropped a tray. Security doors slammed shut too late. The new nurse stood near the medication cart, hands still, eyes forward. She had been laughed at an hour earlier, for moving too carefully, for asking too many questions, for not reacting fast enough. Now, as armed men flooded the ER and everyone froze, she did not raise her voice. She did not run. She watched. No one noticed the way she shifted her weight. No one noticed the way she counted exits. They would soon learn they were wrong. The emergency room never truly slept. It only shifted between different kinds of noise. At 1:17 a.m., the noise was mechanical. Monitors beeping in uneven rhythms, ventilators sighing, the low hum of fluorescent lights that had not been turned off in years. A stretcher rattled past with a loose wheel. Someone laughed too loudly near the nurse's station, a sound edged with exhaustion rather than humor. The new nurse stood just outside Trauma Bay 3. Her name badge was still too clean. Her shoes did not squeak when she walked. She waited, hands loosely folded at her waist, while a senior nurse finished giving instructions. When the instructions ended, there was no acknowledgement of her presence. The conversation simply moved on without her. She did not interrupt. Around her, the ER moved on instinct and habit. Nurses who had worked together for years passed instruments without looking. Doctors barked orders they assumed would be obeyed. Everyone knew who mattered and who did not, and new people learned quickly where they stood. The new nurse had been there for 6 hours, long enough to be noticed, long enough to be judged. "She's careful," someone had said earlier, not quietly. Another voice followed. "Careful gets you behind." The new nurse had heard it. She always heard things. She had not reacted. In Trauma Bay 3, an elderly man slept under thin sheets, his breathing shallow but steady. She checked the foreline, adjusted it by a few millimeters, then stepped back. The adjustment was precise, practiced. She did not look at the clock. She already knew the time. Across the bay, a doctor snapped his gloves off and tossed them into the bin. "Why is she still hovering?" he asked no one in particular. "She's new," a nurse replied. "Transferred in, night shift, that explains it." The new nurse took a step back, giving space without being told. She scanned the room, not in a nervous way but methodically. Exit, equipment, people. She catalogued them all unconsciously, the way some people counted steps without meaning to. A crash echoed from the ambulance entrance. Raised voices followed. Another one coming in, someone called out. Possible internal bleeding. The ER shifted gears. Gurneys moved. Curtains were pulled. A controlled chaos settled over the room. The new nurse moved when needed and stopped when not. She did not rush. She did not freeze. She anticipated rather than reacted, handing over supplies seconds before they were requested. Once a doctor paused, looking at her as if surprised she had already done what he was about to ask. He said nothing. At the nurse's station, 2 staff members leaned close, whispering, "She doesn't talk much. Maybe she can't keep up, or maybe she's just not cut out for this place." The new nurse passed behind them, unheard. Her posture was straight but relaxed, shoulders loose. No wasted movement, no visible tension. She checked a patient chart and frowned, not dramatically, just enough to register something. A medication dosage had been logged twice. She corrected it quietly, initials small and neat. No one thanked her. A security guard walked through the ER, slower than usual. He paused near the entrance, hand resting on his belt. The new nurse noticed. She also noticed the way the automatic doors hesitated before closing, as if overridden briefly by another system. She said nothing. At 1:42 a.m., laughter broke out near the break room. Someone had made a joke about a spilled coffee, about how the night was dragging. The new nurse did not join in. She was watching the hallway instead, eyes tracking a man in a delivery jacket who did not belong to any service she recognized. He disappeared around a corner. She made a mental note. When she returned to the medication cart, a senior nurse shook her head slightly. "You're too stiff," she said, not unkindly. "You'll loosen up, or you won't last." The new nurse met her eyes. For a moment, there was something unreadable there. Depth, calculation, but it passed almost immediately. "I understand," she said. Her voice was calm, neutral, unremarkable. The senior nurse turned away, satisfied. The new nurse adjusted the cart, aligning the drawers perfectly, then stood still again. Around her, the ER continued to pulse with life and fatigue, unaware of how fragile its order really was. No one noticed the way the new nurse positioned herself slightly closer to the center of the room. No one noticed the way she angled her body toward the exits. At that moment, she was just another quiet nurse on a night shift, new, underestimated, and already forgotten. For now. The first sign was the radio. It crackled once at the security desk, a burst of static sharp enough to make the guard frown. He tapped the side of the unit, muttered something about interference, and turned the volume down. The noise faded. The concern did not. The new nurse heard it anyway. She was charting vitals at the far end of the ER, pen moving steadily when her eyes lifted, not toward the desk, but toward the ceiling. The sound had not come from above, but she had learned long ago to confirm direction before meaning. She finished the line she was writing, closed the file, looked up. Across the room, the charge nurse was arguing with admissions about bed availability. A trauma resident rubbed his eyes and leaned against the counter, fatigue etched deep into his posture. No one was watching the security desk anymore. The new nurse walked past it on her way to the supply room. The guard noticed her only because she stopped. "Everything okay?" she asked. Her tone was casual, polite, the kind of question asked 100 times a night. "Yeah," he said. "Just bad reception." She nodded once and kept walking. Inside the supply room, the fluorescent light flickered twice before stabilizing. She paused, hands still on the door, counting silently. When the light held, she stepped inside and gathered what she needed with efficient movements. On her way out, she glanced at the wall-mounted television. Local news muted. A scrolling banner mentioned a traffic disruption several blocks away due to a police operation. No details. She did not slow. At 2:03 a.m., an ambulance that was scheduled to arrive did not. Dispatch called to explain it had been rerouted. The explanation was vague. A multi-vehicle incident, limited access. The words did not align with the map in the new nurse's head. She approached the nurse's station. "Which route was blocked?" she asked. The unit clerk shrugged. "Didn't say. Did they give a perimeter?" The clerk looked at her, confused. "A what?" The new nurse hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Never mind." She stepped away before anyone could question why a nurse cared about perimeters. In Trauma Bay 1, a patient began to desaturate. The room filled with motion again. Oxygen adjusted. Alarms acknowledged. Orders given. The new nurse assisted smoothly, her hands steady as she repositioned the patient. While she worked, she listened. Not to the voices closest to her, but to the gaps between them. The rhythm of the ER had changed, not faster, tighter, like people unconsciously holding their breath. Another security guard appeared near the entrance, this one speaking quietly into his shoulder mic. The doors slid open and closed twice in quick succession, triggered manually instead of automatically. The new nurse noticed both. She passed the guard and slowed just enough to catch a fragment of his radio traffic, confirming visuals. No, not yet. She kept walking. At the medication station, a senior nurse glanced at her. "You're pacing," she said. "I'm counting," the new nurse replied before she could stop herself. The senior nurse raised an eyebrow. Counting what? The new nurse met her gaze. For a second the answer hovered. Honest, specific, wrong for this place. She chose another. Dosages, she said. The senior nurse snorted. Relax. This isn't your first day in medicine. No, the new nurse said quietly. It isn't. The senior nurse had already turned away. At 2:19 a.m. the hospital intercom chimed, a test tone followed by silence, no announcement, no explanation. The new nurse stopped what she was doing. Tests were scheduled, logged, announced. This had been none of those. She looked toward the ambulance bay. Two orderlies stood near the doors talking in low voices. One of them gestured outside, his hand slicing the air in a sharp, nervous motion. She felt it then. Not fear, but confirmation. Something was moving toward them. Not an accident, not a patient, a convergence. She adjusted her badge, tucking it closer to her chest, and repositioned herself near the central corridor again. Close enough to see multiple entrances, far enough not to draw attention. Around her, the ER carried on, unaware that its margins were shrinking. The new nurse said nothing. She never did, until there was no time left not to. The doors closed first, not all at once, not dramatically, one after another, with a dull hydraulic finality that barely cut through the noise of the ER. The ambulance bay was sealed. The side corridor followed. The main entrance hesitated, then locked. A red indicator light flickered on above security. "What's that?" someone asked. No one answered. The new nurse was already moving. She did not run. She did not rush toward the doors. She stepped sideways, positioning herself between two gurneys, eyes tracking the corridor that led from the ambulance bay into the heart of the ER. That was when the shouting started. Not panicked shouting. Controlled, sharp, male voices issuing commands, not requests. A security guard stumbled backward into view, hands raised. Blood ran from a cut on his forehead, thin and bright. Behind him came three men in dark jackets, faces uncovered, weapons held low but ready. The ER froze. Someone screamed. A tray clattered to the floor. A patient monitor went into alarm, the shrill sound slicing through the air. "Everyone stay where you are," one of the men said. His voice was calm, professional, not loud. That was worse. Doctors stopped mid-step. Nurses instinctively clustered near patients' bodies angled protectively. No one argued. No one tried to be brave. The men moved with purpose, spacing themselves out, controlling angles and sightlines. They did not point their weapons at the ceiling. They pointed them where people were. The new nurse watched their feet. She noted who took points, who covered the rear, who kept glancing toward the locked doors, impatient. This was not a robbery, not a random act. This was a problem that had followed them inside. "Trauma staff," the lead man said. "We need a doctor, now." A senior physician stepped forward, jaw tight. "This is a hospital." The man's gaze flicked to him, then away. Dismissive. "You have an injured man coming in. He needs surgery. You will help him." "No," the physician said. "Put the weapon down." The new nurse inhaled once, slowly. She stepped forward before the silence could break into something worse. "I can help stabilize him," she said. Her voice was even, not challenging, not afraid. Several heads turned toward her, surprised, annoyed. The senior nurse shot her a look that said, "Stay back." The armed man assessed her in a single glance. Shoes, hands, expression. He nodded. "You," he said. "Fine, stay close." She did not argue. They brought the injured man in on a stretcher stolen from an ambulance outside. He was pale, sweating. A makeshift bandage pressed hard against his side. His breathing was shallow, uneven. The new nurse moved automatically, gloved hands already working. She checked the wound, adjusted pressure, signaled for supplies without raising her voice. "Light," she said softly. Someone flipped it on. As she worked, she felt the ER's panic pressing in on her from all sides. staff frozen between instinct and fear, patients staring wide-eyed, unable to flee. She kept her focus narrow. Bleeding, pulse, airway. Behind her, one of the intruders paced. Another spoke quietly into a radio, voice clipped. Inside now, yes, negative on extraction. The words were not meant for her, but she heard them. Outside the trauma bay, security tried to coordinate, whispers traveling in nervous waves. A nurse near the wall was crying silently, shoulders shaking. The new nurse caught her eye and shook her head once. Small, firm, breathe, stay still. The crying slowed. A sudden bang echoed from the ambulance bay doors, someone outside testing them. The intruders tensed, weapons lifting a few inches. Enough, the lead man snapped. Do your job. The new nurse did. She stabilized the patient with calm efficiency, making no sudden movements, speaking only when necessary. When the injured man thrashed, she held him, not forcefully, but with practiced restraint, positioning her body to limit his motion without causing pain. The lead man noticed. "You've done this before," he said. She did not answer. Another bang, louder this time. The ER lights flickered. "Time," the man muttered. He looked at the nurse. "How long?" "Minutes," she said. "If he keeps bleeding like this." It was not a lie. The man cursed under his breath. He turned away, speaking urgently into his radio now. The new nurse finished securing the line and stepped back, hands still raised, visible. She met the lead man's eyes briefly, then lowered her gaze. Submission, not fear. Around them, the ER remained locked in place, a fragile stillness stretched thin by threat and uncertainty. No one noticed the way the new nurse subtly shifted a cart closer to the door. No one noticed the way she placed herself between the patient and the corridor. The lockdown had begun, and it was not going to end the way anyone expected. The intruder's voice cut through the ER like a scalpel. "Move aside." A junior doctor froze mid-step, fingers hovering over a chart. His pulse thudded audibly in his own ears. A nurse clutched a clipboard as if it were a shield. The lead intruder stepped forward. His gaze swept the room, measuring, testing. A patient groaned nearby. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and blood, a tension that only heightened every instinct. "Step back," he repeated. "This patient comes first." A senior surgeon stepped in. He towered over the nurse and the intruder, his voice sharp and unyielding. "This is my patient," he said. "You leave now or I call security." The intruder's gaze flicked toward the surgeon just for a fraction of a second. Then he scanned the room. His weapon remained low-ready, controlled and precise. "Help us stabilize him," the intruder said, nodding toward the patient on the stretcher, "or this goes poorly." The surgeon's chest rose and fell. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a nurse whispered, "We can't." The new nurse stepped forward. "I can help," she said, calm, almost detached. Her hands remained relaxed at her sides, but the room seemed to pause at the certainty in her tone. The surgeon opened his mouth. "Stay back. I can stabilize him," she interrupted softly. "I need room and a few supplies." The intruder studied her briefly, then he nodded. Not approval, not deference, just acknowledgement of competence. The new nurse moved into position. She did not speak unnecessarily. She did not gesticulate. She pulled gloves from a nearby cart, secured a line, and scanned the patient's vitals. She noticed the subtle tremor in the man's hands, the first sign of hypovolemic shock. She adjusted the oxygen mask, checked the IV, and applied pressure to the wound. Every movement is precise, controlled, predictable in a way that reassured others without drawing attention. A nurse to her left hesitated, unsure whether to follow her instructions. The new nurse simply caught her gaze, raised an eyebrow, and pointed toward the suction. The nurse obeyed instantly. Behind them, the intruder kept watch, speaking quietly into a radio, evaluating, calculating. The ER staff could only stare, realizing too late that the nurse was not overwhelmed. She was orchestrating, quietly, without spectacle. A ventilator alarm beeped. She moved, adjusting the rate. watching the patient's chest rise and fall in rhythm with her hands. Another nurse reached for the control panel. The new nurse put a firm hand on it. "I've got it," she said. Her tone left no room for argument. The nurse stepped back, relieved. From across the bay, the surgeon frowned, unsure how to respond. The intruder, however, allowed her autonomy. A nod, subtle, almost imperceptible, signaled the end of confrontation. Another intruder shifted. He had spotted a minor mistake in the patient's bandaging and reached to correct it. The new nurse caught his wrist mid-motion, steadying it with gentle force. Not a warning, not a threat, just authority. "Let me," she said. He hesitated, then withdrew. The patient's vitals stabilized under her hands. No one clapped, no one praised, but a quiet shift had occurred, a subtle reordering of the room's hierarchy. The intruders moved again, positioning themselves near exits, scanning, restless. Staff continued to freeze in place, unsure whether to act or wait. The new nurse's calm held the space, gave others a reference point without ever saying she was in control. When the injured man thrashed, she applied restraint, not harsh, not violent, just enough to prevent further harm. Every motion had intention, every pause had meaning. For the first time, the intruders took note. "You've done this before," one said quietly, almost to himself. The new nurse's lips did not move. She did not answer. The room's tension remained high, but the immediate threat had been diffused without violence. Staff began to realize that the nurse, quiet, underestimated, ignored, was the only stabilizing force in the room. Yet no one understood how far her competence would reach. The first confrontation ended not with sound, but with a silent acknowledgement. The nurse had won without a fight, and everyone in the room, even the armed intruders, knew it. The ER had become a cage. The intruders occupied key corridors. Staff huddled near patients. Alarms beeped intermittently. Outside, sirens were faint but insistent, a distant promise that help was on its way. Inside, the new nurse moved with a quiet precision. She did not raise her voice. She did not make any grand gestures. She did not ask for acknowledgement. She simply began to guide the flow of the room. A gurney blocked access to the triage bay. She positioned herself beside it, adjusting it just enough to create a narrow pathway. A nurse carrying supplies hesitated. She pointed with the tip of a gloved finger. The nurse understood immediately, pivoted, and moved without a word. She shifted a chair to block the line of sight between the patient in Trauma Bay 2 and one of the intruders who had started pacing near the corridor. The staff didn't notice her doing it. They noticed only the sense of safety that seemed to settle over the room, however faint. The injured man from earlier still needed monitoring. The new nurse checked his vitals again, hands steady, eyes scanning not only the patient but the surrounding space. She calculated angles, exit routes, lines of fire that did not exist yet. The intruders moved among the beds, assessing, impatient. One of them gestured sharply to a doctor. The doctor froze. The new nurse stepped forward, not between the man and the doctor, but angled in a way that made both feel secure. A subtle redirection of attention, a non-verbal command. She whispered instructions to the staff, light adjustments, patient positioning, preparation of supplies, nothing more. No yelling, no rushing, no dramatics. They complied automatically, instinctively. She gave no credit and no one asked. Time passed in measured minutes. A sudden clatter drew everyone's attention. A gurney wheel had caught a lip in the tile. Staff moved to steady it. The new nurse was there first, one hand steadying the wheel, the other pressing lightly on the patient's shoulder. She corrected it before anyone even realized it had shifted. The pacing intruder noticed. He froze, studied her silently for a second. Then he returned to his patrol, tension lingering in his shoulders. The new nurse's attention never wavered. She was aware of the faint vibrations of the floor as people moved. The small shifts in air currents from doors opening and closing, the subtle changes in the intruder's posture. Outside, faint echoes of vehicle engines hinted at the approaching federal units. She did not check the clock. She did not wonder how long it would take. She simply prepared the space for their arrival, anticipating rather than reacting. A nurse looked toward her. "What are you doing?" She smiled faintly without amusement. "Keeping us alive until they arrive." The nurse nodded, not understanding, not questioning, just nodding. A second intruder approached the central bay, noticing the order of supplies. He frowned, reached to move a tray. The new nurse's hand intercepted gently, repositioning it slightly, just enough to prevent a misstep in haste. "You're careful," he muttered. She did not respond. For the next 20 minutes the ER moved like a silent machine. The intruders monitored patients. Staff followed subtle cues. The new nurse kept the rhythm, correcting, adjusting, shifting. Every action was deliberate. Every intervention minimized risk without creating alarm. The injured man stabilized further under her care. A nurse began administering medications in precise timing with her subtle signals. Another moved quietly to cover a window where sunlight would soon rise. She did not look for praise. She did not make herself visible. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder. The FBI agent's presence was close, but still unseen. The new nurse sensed it, like a pulse, and factored it into her calculations. The room remained tense. Threat was present but controlled. She had not issued orders. She had not spoken above a whisper. And yet, the ER functioned as if she were in charge. No one could say why, and that was precisely the point. The tension in the ER thickened, like a storm pressing down on fragile ground. The injured man's condition fluctuated. His breathing became shallow again, and his skin turned pale under the harsh lights. Every nurse in the room hovered near his bedside, unsure when to act, when to stay frozen. Outside the trauma bay, the intruder's patience frayed. One of them tapped a foot rhythmically against the tile, glancing toward the locked doors as if expecting reinforcements that had not yet arrived. Another spoke quietly into his radio, his voice clipped and urgent. The new nurse observed both angles, calculating each threat as she checked the patient's IV line. She noted the faint tremor in the hands of the pacing intruder, a subtle clue that he was growing agitated, unpredictable. A junior nurse, tasked with monitoring vitals, whispered, "I don't think he's going to make it." The new nurse crouched slightly beside the bed. Her gloved hands moved to adjust the oxygen mask, her eyes never leaving the patient's chest. "He will," she said softly, "if we don't make mistakes." It was not reassurance, it was a fact. Moments later, a second patient, an elderly man recovering from surgery, began coughing violently, dislodging his tube. The staff panicked. The new nurse moved to him instantly, guiding his arms gently, stabilizing the tube without a word. She had no right to prioritize him, but she did so with careful judgment, balancing both crises simultaneously. A commotion erupted near the central corridor. One of the intruders had stepped too close to a medication cart. A nurse froze. The man barked an order. The new nurse intervened with nothing but a quiet shift of her weight, placing herself between the intruder and the cart. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but enough. The intruder's hand paused mid-motion, and he corrected his position without incident. Time pressed against the walls. Each passing minute brought risk from both sides, the intruders, the fragile patients, and the potential arrival of outside forces that could escalate the situation further. The new nurse's mind raced silently. Angles, timing, human behavior, weapon reach, escape paths. She moved through the space like a shadow, unseen, yet shaping the flow of events with subtle interventions. A stretcher was accidentally pushed too close to a gurney, threatening to tip. She adjusted the balance with one hand while steadying a patient with the other. The intruder, who had been pacing abruptly, froze and looked at her. Recognition flickered in his eyes, a brief acknowledgement that she was competent, a force that could not be ignored. "You know what you're doing," he muttered. She did not answer. Minutes later, the first intruder lost his temper. He raised his voice, demanding the immediate evacuation of the injured man. Panic rippled through the room. Staff faltered, unsure how to comply without worsening the situation. The new nurse stepped in front of the patient. She held her hands slightly out, palms down. Her stance was calm, measured. "Follow my lead," she said quietly. The intruder hesitated, then allowed her to position the patient carefully on a gurney, stabilizing him with controlled movement. She guided a nurse to administer fluids while maintaining observation of the intruder's every gesture. Outside, distant sirens grew louder, but the new nurse did not allow herself to hope. She knew the first wave of federal assistance would not enter for several more minutes. Every second was hers to control. One of the intruders leaned too close to the patient's bed, impatience breaking through his professional mask. The new nurse's hand touched his forearm lightly. Not an attack, not a push, just a restraint born of experience. "Step back," she said. He obeyed, surprised by the authority in her quiet tone. The room held its collective breath. The injured man's vitals slowly stabilized. Another nurse began documenting events, hands shaking slightly. The new nurse guided them, subtly, silently, with no need for words. Every decision carried risk, every action had consequences. One misstep could ignite chaos. She felt the pressure from both sides, the intruders testing her limits, the patients depending on her, the staff relying on cues they barely understood. And yet she remained unshaken. The new nurse knew she could not falter. She would not falter, because if she did, no one else could hold the room together, and no one yet realized just how much she already had. The ER had fallen into a tense rhythm. Staff moved with cautious precision. Patients were monitored. The intruders lingered, restless but contained. And somewhere outside, the faint but certain presence of federal units was closing in. A sudden knock echoed through the secure entrance to the administrative office. Not loud, not hurried, just firm. The kind of knock that carries authority without demanding immediate attention. Moments later, a man in a crisp suit, badge clipped discreetly to his belt, stepped into the ER. His expression was calm, unassuming, but the air around him shifted subtly. Every movement was deliberate, measured. He scanned the room with a practiced eye, noting patient positions, the intruder's postures, and finally resting briefly on the new nurse. "I need the nurse on duty," he said quietly, addressing the charge nurse rather than the intruders. The room froze. The intruders looked up, confused. The staff whispered, speculated. The charge nurse hesitated. "The one handling the trauma patient," he clarified. A ripple ran through the ER. A few nurses glanced at the new nurse, uncertain. She remained still, her hands resting on the edge of the stretcher, eyes tracking the injured man's vitals. The federal agent stepped closer, quietly, respectfully. "I need her by name," he said, not loud, not commanding. But every word carried weight. The new nurse's chest rose slightly. She did not step forward immediately. There was a pause, a moral choice. To respond meant exposure. To stay silent risked delaying the resolution. She exhaled once, smooth and controlled. "I'm here," she said, calm, even. The agent nodded ever so slightly. That small acknowledgement held more weight than any verbal recognition could convey. It was not praise, it was confirmation, an external validation of competence the ER had yet to understand. The intruders noticed. They had assumed she was simply a nurse, quiet, underestimated and manageable. That assumption had been tested before. Now it was being confirmed by someone they respected. One intruder muttered something under his breath, but the agent's calm presence silenced any further comment. The new nurse moved to the agent's side, keeping her eyes on the patient. She spoke softly, almost inaudibly, providing status updates and options for extraction and stabilization. Her hands adjusted 4 lines, her fingers steady, precise. Every movement is deliberate, controlled, and silent. The agent listened, nodding once, twice, as if absorbing a report from someone he had known for years. Yet she had never spoken of her background, never revealed her experience. The room would never know. She guided staff subtly, positioning a gurney closer to the entry corridor, adjusting lighting to reduce glare, arranging supplies so they were immediately accessible. No one noticed these small interventions except for the agent. "Good," he said quietly, just above a whisper. "Keep it steady." The new nurse's lips remained neutral. Her actions were her acknowledgement. No words needed. The intruders shifted uneasily. Their control had been undermined not by force, but by authority recognized silently and externally. Minutes later, the agent spoke briefly into a radio. Instructions, coordination, precise timing. The intruders tensed but did not react. The ER staff watched, confused and unsure, but they obeyed the unspoken rhythm set by the new nurse. She glanced at the injured man. His vitals were stabilizing, thanks to her interventions and guidance. Her hands rested lightly on the side of the stretcher, not touching, simply ready. Another knock, this one louder, signaled the arrival of additional federal personnel. The new nurse did not flinch. She continued her quiet oversight, guiding patients and staff with the same understated authority. The agent turned to her, just enough for her to notice. No words passed, only a subtle nod, recognition without fanfare, a confirmation of skill, competence, and control. She stepped back slightly, allowing the agent and his team to move forward, but her eyes never left the room. She remained the unseen center of the storm, the quiet pivot around which the ER rotated. Staff began to realize slowly that the nurse they had underestimated, the one they had laughed at, doubted, and ignored, was not simply competent. She was indispensable, yet she sought no spotlight, no praise, no acknowledgement beyond what was necessary to keep the room safe. The federal agent spoke once more, quietly, decisively, into his radio. And then, just as quietly, he stepped aside, allowing the new nurse to remain at her post, managing, calculating, controlling, not for glory, but because no one else could. The room shifted subtly. Fear had lessened, tension had eased slightly. The crisis was moving toward resolution, and the new nurse remained invisible to most, except to those who truly mattered. Her identity had been acknowledged, not celebrated, not announced, simply recognized by someone with the authority to see it. It was enough. The federal team moved with quiet precision. They entered the ER without fanfare, their weapons lowered, voices calm, almost conversational. The intruders, previously tense and restless, froze. Their posture shifted immediately, a subtle acknowledgement of authority they recognized instantly. The new nurse remained where she had been, near the injured man, hands resting lightly on the edge of the stretcher, eyes scanning the room. She did not step aside, but she did not interfere. Her presence alone set the rhythm. The lead intruder looked at her for a moment, hesitation flickering across his face. The others followed suit, unsure of whether to resist or comply. The federal agent, the one who had requested her by name, gave a single nod toward her. It was quiet, almost invisible to everyone else. That nod was permission, signal, acknowledgement. The intruders lowered their weapons. "Move calmly," the agent instructed. No sudden actions. The new nurse guided the ER staff, not with commands, but with subtle gestures. Pointing, repositioning, guiding hands. A nurse carrying a tray paused uncertainly. She tilted her head toward the corridor and extended a hand just slightly. The nurse followed without thinking. The intruders were hurting themselves, subconsciously influenced by her presence, by the way she moved without noise or urgency. She did not speak, she did not act aggressively. Every subtle shift of her body, every pause, was enough. The injured man was stabilized enough to be moved. The new nurse helped position him on the gurney, checking 4 lines, ensuring monitors were secure. She gave only necessary instructions, speaking softly to staff, never raising her voice. One of the intruders stepped too close to the patient and instinctively reached for him. She caught his wrist mid-motion, not harshly, not as a threat, just a quiet redirection of intent. He froze, then stepped back, acknowledgement in his eyes. Outside, the sound of additional units arriving, helicopters, unmarked SUVs, added pressure, but the ER felt calm. Tense, yes, but controlled. And it was because of her. Minutes passed, each patient was accounted for, each intruder was contained, each movement is measured. The lead intruder finally moved toward the exit, hands raised slightly. Another intruder followed. The federal team guided them with calm authority. The new nurse remained near the central bay, monitoring vitals, adjusting lines, ensuring no sudden mistakes. No one thanked her, no one applauded. The federal agent gave only a brief glance, a nod that said more than words could. The intruders left quietly, and left the hospital without incident. The ER staff began to exhale collectively, realizing the crisis had ended without major injury, without chaos consuming the room. They looked around for someone to praise, to credit. Most looked at her, then looked away, uncertain. She returned to her station, arranging supplies with the same quiet care she had shown hours before. Her gloves were still on, her eyes scanning monitors and patients alike. She straightened charts, aligned drawers, and wiped down a counter. The federal agent lingered near the doorway, watching briefly. He did not approach. He did not speak. His presence alone was enough recognition. After a moment, he walked away. The new nurse exhaled softly. The adrenaline faded. She allowed herself the slightest shift of shoulders, no relief, no celebration, just acknowledgement of what had been done. Outside, vehicles departed. The night resumed its rhythm. The ER, though scarred by the incident, returned to its regular hum. Monitors beeped. Patients murmured. The staff whispered. Life continued. The new nurse finished her shift, cleaned her station, and stepped toward the exit. The lights in the corridor reflected softly on her shoes. No one stopped her. No one called her name. The laughter and doubt from the night before felt distant, irrelevant. She exited the hospital quietly. The city slept. The ER slept. The world, largely unaware, continued its ordinary pace. And she walked home alone. No spotlight, no applause. Only the quiet weight of competence, carried without recognition, earned and maintained in silence. She had been underestimated. She had been observed, tested, and acknowledged in subtle ways by those who mattered. And that was enough. The world would not know her name, not fully. But in that ER, in those critical moments, she had been the pivot on which order turned, and she had done it without anyone knowing. The ER returned to its familiar rhythm. Monitors beeped steadily. Alarms that had shrieked in panic hours earlier were now muted or silenced. The scent of antiseptic lingered, mingling with the faint odor of blood from patients long stabilized. Staff moved with tentative normalcy, glancing toward the trauma bays but avoiding the memory of what had just occurred. The new nurse finished logging the final vitals for her patients. She adjusted an IV line, checked a monitor, and straightened a tray of supplies. Every action was precise, deliberate, almost ritualistic. There had been no fanfare, no applause, no acknowledgement of the quiet authority she had exercised throughout the night. She walked slowly to the station, double-checking charts and aligning pens and papers. A junior nurse, still pale from the ordeal, looked at her, eyes wide. "You handled everything so calmly," the nurse whispered. The new nurse offered a faint nod. No words. Her actions had been enough. Words were unnecessary. She gathered her belongings, badge, stethoscope, keys. Every movement is meticulous. The weight of the night pressed on her shoulders, but she carried it silently, as if it were always meant to be borne alone. Outside the ER, the hospital corridor was quiet. The lights reflected off the polished floor. She walked toward the exit, her steps measured. No one called her name, no one stopped her. In the parking lot, she noticed a black SUV pulling away. Unmarked, unnoticed by everyone else. She did not hurry, she did not look back. The nod from the federal agent, small and almost invisible, lingered in her mind. That single acknowledgement was enough. It was recognition without ceremony. She stepped into the night. The city was calm. Traffic hummed faintly in the distance. Streetlights cast long shadows. The adrenaline of the ER, the chaos, the threat, all of it receded into memory. At home, she set her keys on the counter, removed her shoes and folded her uniform with methodical care. She prepared a small glass of water, drank slowly, and allowed herself the quiet weight of exhaustion. No one would know what had truly happened. The ER staff would recall fragments, the calmness amidst chaos, the precision in a storm, but not the depth of her control, not the quiet competence that had kept everyone alive. No one outside the hospital would ever know her name, and that was exactly as it should be. She had been underestimated, she had been tested, and she had acted with authority, restraint, and precision. Her work was done, not for recognition, not for praise, not for glory, simply because it was necessary. She sat in silence for a few moments, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. Calm, heavy, earned. Then she rose, turned off the lights and left the room exactly as she had found it, orderly, contained and ready for the next shift. The world slept, the ER slept, and she walked forward, unseen, uncelebrated, indispensable.